Hello students. Today we are going to be going over MLA paraphrasing. This is Professor Valerie Pell from Wright College, one of the city colleges of Chicago, and I'm in the English department. In this presentation, we'll go over what paraphrases are. We'll look at the do's and don'ts of print paraphrases, the do's and don'ts of online paraphrases. We'll look at indirect source quotes and paraphrases as a review. We'll look at summaries, how to cite them, and we'll have an assessment at the end. So to begin, what is a paraphrase? A paraphrase is when you take the idea or words of a source, someone besides yourself, and you put it almost entirely in your own words. We often do this with a paraphrase because we like the idea of the source that we found, but we want to put that idea more in our own voice. So we want to borrow an idea, but we want it to sound like our own writing style, like ourselves as writers. Paraphrases are generally about the same length as the original wording by the original author. And you'll find that this is different with a summary. Summaries condense, whereas paraphrases keep about the same length. So let's look at some do's and don'ts of print source paraphrases. So the do's. You always do want to cite your original source. If you don't cite your source, then you're plagiarizing. You do want to use all of your own words. If you occasionally use a term or a phrase or particular jargon that might be applicable to the source, or a term that your reader might be unfamiliar with, you could just pull that one word out and put that word or that one phrase in quotation marks, while the rest of your paraphrase would be all in your own words. You do want to use the sandwich, where we introduce the paraphrase with a signal phrase, such as according to and the name of the author, or the name of the author or the speaker who said the paraphrase, and with a signal phrase, one of those lead-in verbs. Then you would give the original idea from that source, all in your own words, and then you would explain it in your own words about how it's relevant to be used in your particular piece of writing. And with print sources, you do want to use page numbers because books have page numbers. Print magazines have page numbers. Print sources like newspapers, that if you read it in print, there's usually a page number, so you do want to use that when you're paraphrasing. It's very important. Now, some of the don'ts when you're using you're paraphrasing print sources. Don't just change one or two words and call it a paraphrase, okay? You can't just change one verb and say, oh, now it's in my own words. That's not a paraphrase. That's a direct quote that you've changed one word in. And if you do that and you don't use quotation marks, then you've just plagiarized. You don't want to do this thing called patch writing. Patch writing, students are often tempted to do this because it's really easy to do now, in even with print sources, because we often can find print sources online. Or we might just feel like copying and pasting or typing exactly what we read in a book. And then a student might go through and change every other word to his or her own version of the words, or highlight every other word and find a synonym in the word processing program. Patch writing is plagiarism. Just like you don't want to just change one or two words and call it a paraphrase, you don't want to change every third word or every conjunction or every verb and call it a paraphrase, because it's not. That's patch writing, and that is a form of plagiarism. So please see Little Single Handbook on page 102 for more information about patch writing. And also, when you're paraphrasing, you don't want to put in quotation marks your whole entire paraphrase. The reason why is those words are yours. While you're borrowing the idea from the original source, you're not taking the original source's words, you're using your own. So that when you do cite your source, your reader will know from the citation and from your signal phrase that you're borrowing the idea. And when you give that information without using quotation marks, your reader knows that it's a paraphrase, that you've borrowed the idea but you've put it in your own words. That's why you don't use quotation marks. So here's an example of the quotation sandwich with a print direct quote. According to author Eric Schlosser, the fast food industry pays the minimum wage to a higher proportion of its workers than any other industry. This suggests that the fast food industry is taking advantage of its employees. Okay, so you'll see here that we begin with the signal phrase. We give Eric Schlosser's name. Then we have the comma, the direct quote, the end of the quote, the parentheses, and then we put the period after that parentheses, because that's where that entire sentence ends. So we've introduced the quote, we've given the quote, and we've explained it. Now, if we were to do the same thing but with a paraphrase, it would be very similar. It might look something like this. According to the author Eric Schlosser, no other industry in the U.S. pays more of its workers minimum wage than the fast food industry. This suggests that the fast food industry is taking advantage of its employees. So you see here, we've still told the reader who is given this idea, but then we've totally reworded it in our own words. You may notice that some of the phrases are a little bit similar because those words are hard to find synonyms for, such as minimum wage. And we might have used the word industry. Sometimes it's hard to get every single word out, but if you see that the syntax of this has been rewritten so that it's completely new. And then we've given the page number at the end and ended the paraphrase with the period after the parentheses. And then we've gone on to explain the paraphrase. And as a reminder, print sources need page numbers, okay? So don't forget that. If you are citing your print source, if your print source has a page number that is consistent, where if somebody else were to pick up the same print version, you need to have a page number. Okay, so on to the do's and don'ts of online source paraphrases. To begin with, the do's. Now this is going to sound familiar after what we just went over, but let's look at it again to reinforce these ideas. Just like with print sources, you do want to cite the original source when you're citing a paraphrase online. You do want to use all of your own words when you're paraphrasing an online source. The exception is if there are particular terms that the author has used or the original source has used that you also want to use, like if they are particular types of jargon or particular types of words that are very specific, you could reuse those, but put them in quotation marks. You do, again, want to use the quotation sandwich, which is introducing the paraphrase or the quote using the signal phrase to show whose idea it was. Then you would give the paraphrase or the idea from the original source that you're putting into your own words. And then you would give the explanation of what it means and why it's in your paper. So the don'ts about online paraphrasing is, again, you don't want to change just one or two words and call it a paraphrase. You don't want to patch write because patch writing, again, is plagiarism. And you don't want to use quotation marks because quotation marks would suggest that it's a direct quote and you're not directly quoting. And finally, you don't want to use page numbers because there aren't any. And this may get confusing at times, especially if you're reading something or you download an article from an online source. For example, let's say that you downloaded an article from the AtlanticMonthly.com, and you've printed out that article and you've used it many times. Now, when you've downloaded that, it might have page numbers on it, and you might be tempted to use those page numbers. The reason you wouldn't do that is because you've downloaded it from their website, and just because your page numbers seem to be consistent, I could, on a Mac or a different computer, download the same article the next day and the page numbers would not be the same as yours, because it all has to do with each computer's configurations and such. So it's better if you just use a source. If you've accessed it online, even if you've printed it out, you don't need to use the page numbers. Now, that's different if you had the actual physical copy of that Atlantic Monthly article and you accessed it through the print version. Then you would use page numbers, because the print version has consistent page numbers. Okay, so let's look at this example of an online direct quote sandwich. In the article, Lock 'em Up Nation, author Timothy Egan states that, quote, Republicans and Democrats joined together to block spending for federal prosecution of medicinal marijuana in states that allow it. This suggests that Harveys shouldn't be prosecuted since Washington allows medical marijuana. So you see here we've introduced the quote. We've given the name of the author of the article. That would be on our Works Cited page. We've even given the title of the article. Then we've given the quote. We've not put any page numbers there because we accessed this online. And then we've explained the quote. Now, if we wanted to do a paraphrase like this, we might start off very similarly, but you'll notice a couple changes here. In the article, Lock 'em Up Nation, author Timothy Egan states that, as incredible as it might seem, the usually partisan Congress has agreed to stop any federal budgetary support for litigation against medical marijuana cases. This suggests the Harveys shouldn't be prosecuted since Washington allows medical marijuana. So you'll notice here, we've already introduced Timothy Egan, again, the author, whose name would be on our Works Cited page. And then we've given the paraphrase. And then there was really nothing else for us to do in terms of the mechanics of it, because right there at the end, there's no page numbers. So we can just end our paraphrase and move on to the explanation. So online paraphrases and direct quotes, they don't need page numbers. Keep that in mind. All right, now let's look specifically at indirect source paraphrases. So to begin with, I want you to think a minute about what is a direct flight. I like to give this analogy because I think sometimes it helps students understand the difference between a direct source and an indirect source. So let's say that you have a direct flight. You need to get to Chicago and you're in Seattle. If you had a direct flight, that would mean you would go directly from Seattle to Chicago. Absolutely no stops. Now, if you had an indirect flight, you might be in Seattle. You might want to get to Chicago, but that flight company, United Airlines or Southwest or whomever, they want you to go indirect, which means you have to stop in San Diego before you get to Chicago. That is indirect. Okay? Do you see how it's indirect? Because you have to go through a different place to get where you want to be. So when we have an indirect source, that means that sometimes you as a writer, you're going to want to quote or paraphrase someone other than the author of a text. And this is most often easy to think about in these terms. So imagine that you have a reporter of a newspaper, and the reporter has gone and interviewed, say, Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And Mayor Rahm Emanuel has said something that the reporter quoted in the article, and you want to use Rahm Emanuel's words. That would be indirect because Rahm Emanuel did not write the article, the reporter did. So if you want to quote someone that has been quoted in something that you've read, you can do that, but you just have to follow some simple rules about indirect sources. So, let's give a visual for this. So think of this as your student writing what you want to write about. And over here is the direct quote of somebody who didn't write anything down, someone who's just talked about something, or someone who hasn't generated his or her own text. And you want to quote that person or paraphrase them. Well, then what you have to do is you just have to go through the author who did write down that idea from the person who said it. Okay? And in that way, it's indirect. Okay, so the author wrote the article, and that author's name is going to be on your works cited page. And then the indirect person is who actually said the idea. So an indirect source must show who said or gave the original idea. And it's easiest if you do that with a signal phrase. And then you also need to give the where you found the idea that you've paraphrased. You should give the author of the text where you found that idea, and that will be the person who's on the works cited page. And the way that you'll do that is that in the parenthetical citation at the end of your paraphrase, you'll use this abbreviation QTD period IN, quoted in front of the author's name or whatever appears first on your works cited page. Even though it's a paraphrase, you still use QTD period in, quoted in. Your reader can tell that it's a paraphrase because you've not used any quotation marks. So in an example here, it might look something like this. In talking about the landscape of Southern California, Carl Karcher stated, quote, "This is heaven." And then you see the abbreviation here quoted in Schlosser 13. This is ironic because he later explains that he did not see the destruction of Anaheim's landscape as problematic. So you see what's happened here. Carl Karcher is who said this quote. But Carl Karcher didn't write his own book. Eric Schlosser wrote the book. So we've given the direct quote, and then we've given where you could find that quote. What book, what author got that information, and it's quoted in Schlosser. Schlosser would be on our works cited page. Now, if we were to do this as a paraphrase, an indirect paraphrase, it would look something like this. In talking about the landscape of Southern California, Carl Karcher suggested it was an idyllic paradise, quoted in Schlosser 13. This is ironic because he later explains that he did not see the destruction of Anaheim's landscape as problematic. So you see here we still have introduced Carl Karcher, we've given the paraphrase, and then we've given the same parenthetical reference back to Eric Schlosser, the person who wrote the text, the person who took that direct quote from Carl Karcher and wrote it down. Now, if you have an online source, it might look something like this. Upon reviewing the Harveys case and records, Dr. Greg Carter proclaimed that they were ordinary people who were nothing like stereotypical gangsters, quoted in Egan. Dr. Carter's assessment seems in line with the evidence of the case. The Harveys are not drug lords or pushers. So in this instance, we have introduced the paraphrase that we're going to give by giving the name of who gave the idea, Dr. Greg Carter. Then we've given the paraphrase, and if you notice at the end of the paraphrase we've put quoted in Egan. Egan is the reporter whose article we read. Egan quoted Dr. Greg Carter, and it's from Egan that we knew what Dr. Greg Carter said so that we could paraphrase it for our paper. Now let's talk a little bit about summary writing and how we are going to cite summaries. So first of all, what is a summary? So in thinking about a summary, I want you to think about how it condenses a long idea, work, or concept down to its most essential parts. A summary will highlight the major concepts in a longer work, but it doesn't deal with any of the deeper meaning of that text. It involves more surface level thinking because it just reports upon ideas and facts. So think about that, the summary writing as just reporting on something something that a text has said. Like, this might be what happens when somebody asks you, hey, did you see that movie last week? And the person says, oh yeah, and then they give the plot summary of what happened. Okay, they don't tell you whether or not they liked the movie. They just say, oh yeah, that was a movie about blah 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 blah. And then they might move into saying whether or not they liked it, to assess it or evaluate it. With a summary, we're just reporting. Okay, summaries are in your own words, kind of like a paraphrase. The difference is that summary takes something much longer and condenses it down to something smaller and more manageable. So you might often condense a whole chapter or a whole book or a whole film, a whole article into a shortened version. And you often use summary when the writer's audience is unfamiliar with a text or an idea that's being written about in your own writing. Now, summary is generally used to help support more meaningful ideas and deeper connection with texts, but it doesn't actually make those connections itself. So here's a little chart about what type of work you might cite and what to do with that citation. So if you wanted to cite a whole book or a whole film or another long work and summarize it into something short, you would introduce the long work with its author and important information to let readers know about it, and mention when you're setting it up that you're talking about the whole work. So you might say, in talking about Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then I might go into explaining the whole plot of that, right? And I don't need to give any in-text page numbers unless I actually pull out a direct quote, because on my works cited page, I'll just list the whole book. And it won't need any page numbers unless I'm talking about a very specific section. Now, if I wanted to talk about a section of a long work, like a chapter or something like that, then I would want to introduce the long work, giving as much information as possible, like the chapter title or the number, and I would give that in a signal phrase. And I wouldn't need page numbers then, because I would have made it pretty clear that I'm summarizing the whole chapter. And I would list that information on the works cited page according to how the handbook says you should cite, like the page numbers for a particular section of a book. So I might do this by saying in Eric Schlosser's chapter 2 of Fast Food Nation, he talks about advertising and its effects on children, right? And then I might go into a little bit more information about that particular chapter. And you see, all I've done there is I've just introduced it and given an example. Then, if you wanted to do a summary of a whole article, essay, or short work, something that's not book length or a long work, you would introduce the author and the title of the short work in a signal phrase. And when you're setting it up, just make sure that it's clear what kind of a piece that is. So you might say, you know, in Mark Bittman's essay, A Bone to Pick, he talks about what's wrong with the food system. And then you would go in and explain a little bit more about that particular essay. But you see, I've introduced him, I've introduced the title of the essay, and I've even called it an essay so that the reader can know about it. And your handbook will have many more specifics and examples if you feel like, oh, what should I do? Your handbook is a great guide for that, as well as your the internet, because the internet can help you all the time in figuring out how to cite something if you draw a blank. And I'm also there to help you as well if you have questions. Of course, I'm not available 24/7 like your book or the internet. Okay, let's move on to our assessment. With this assessment, after I read each question, you should pause your screen, pause the recording so you can give yourself a minute to try to answer the question, and then you can start the push play again, and the answer will pop up for you. So question 1, you don't need to cite your sources when paraphrasing. False. Of course you need to cite your sources when you're paraphrasing. It's very important, because if you don't cite your sources, you're plagiarizing. Question 2. You should use signal phrases to introduce the original source of your paraphrase, both in books and with online sources. True. Of course. Use signal phrases all the time. It makes your integration of sources much smoother. Number 3. Paraphrases require you to use quotation marks. False. Most of the time you won't use quotation marks with paraphrases, because quotation marks suggest that you're taking exact words from your source. But paraphrases are when you reword a source almost entirely or entirely in your own words. Number 4. The point of a paraphrase is to use the idea of a source, but to have that idea put in your own writing style. True. Number 5. You should use a sandwich when paraphrasing. True. Yes, I really want students to realize that integrating their sources well into their writing and have it to have it go smoothly usually means using the quotation sandwich model for their quotes and paraphrases. Number 6, summary is used to condense longer pieces. True. All right, thanks students for watching this video today, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know.